Hello, this is Ipo Swords, and today we're revisiting the 1882 French infantry officer's sword. My first video on this channel was about this sword and its variants. However, back then I didn't have a standard one, and now I do. This sword is completely standard in configuration and materials, unlike many of my other examples. As such, I'm going to use this to establish a baseline video by which I can compare other variants, so that I can have a running series showing the different material and design variations of the 1882. So, let's get started. It has a lenticular or flattened oval cross-section, and it has offset fullers, with the fuller here being on the back edge of the blade, and here being on the front edge of the blade. By having offset fullers, you allow the maximum thickness of blade, as normally a fuller would run down the center of the blade and reduce the overall thickness and stiffness. As a result, for their weight, these are relatively stiff and serviceable swords. This sword is relatively light, at only 690 grams, and featuring substantial hand protection, which means that not all that much weight went into the blade. Part of that comes down to the fact that it does have two rather significant and deep fullers. Another part is that it's not particularly broad and not conducive to good strong cuts. It is, however, relatively stiff, especially considering it is a meter overall, not quite as short as the 1845 I featured in a previous video. The features of the standard 1882 include a white metal hilt made of German silver. German silver is an alloy which contains no actual silver, instead being composed of 60% copper, 20% zinc, and 20% nickel. Because of the nickel content, this alloy also is known as nickel silver. It is worth noting that this hilt is actually coated in another layer of pure nickel for corrosion resistance and so that it shines up nicely for parade duties. Likewise, the blade was coated in nickel, which provided good corrosion resistance. This one has in fact seen some corrosion where the nickel has been damaged. The blade is also one of the unique features of the 1882. This one, being made in Klingenthal, is marked with a C star and a G star on opposite sides of the blade, which tell us conclusively that it was made and inspected in Klingenthal. In terms of hilt design, the standard pattern has 3 bars, a backstrap, a peen, and in this case, a vertically aligned sword knot loop. Other variants will have different styles of hilt if someone custom ordered one. And that brings us to the only non-standard part of this sword. The hilt was produced and marked by the maker Francois and Francois Delacour, who marked their swords with a knight's head and FBD, as can be seen on screen now. They were an outfitter and they fashioned many swords for officers, perhaps people who didn't want it to be completely standard. However, that's not the case for this sword. It still retains all of the standard regulation features. This one does have a small microfracture here, and one of the bars is bent in, indicating that it was either used for training or damaged in a fall. Now, the reason I mentioned this sword may have been damaged in a fall is because the blade has a very slight kink here in the middle of the blade, and the accompanying scabbard has a repaired break in precisely the same spot. To me, this indicates that this was being worn and was then fallen on. This would have bent both the scabbard and the blade and required a comprehensive repair to the scabbard. It was likely cut in 2 spots and then brazed back together with a piece of scrap metal. I presume this was done during the active service life of this sword, as I can't imagine that anyone else would have been wearing it enough to fall over and damage it, and that anyone would bother to repair it, as these are not particularly high value swords. And while they are not particularly high value on the collector's market, back in 1882 to the end of their service life, these swords were rather expensive to produce due to their use of the new German silver alloy. The German silver alloy is relatively strong, but it's also relatively expensive to make compared to the standard brass or bronze alloy that had been used in French swords previous to this. You can see that there is a ribbed and wire-wrapped grip on this sword. The grip is made out of horn, most likely buffalo horn. However, some rare variants, which I'll show later, use different grip constructions and different grip materials. Some have even reportedly used rhino horn, although I cannot conclusively test that without using destructive methods. The 1882 is how I started my collecting journey. I saw one, I wanted one, and so I bought one. That sword will form the next video. Much like this, it looks fairly standard until you get closer. If you're interested in a presentation grade 1882, make sure you stay tuned for the next video. This has been IPO Swords on the 1882. Until next time, stay sharp.